useful for you. Right. Is your research interesting, innovative enough to publish? And I've got an example from the instructions to authors from a journal that's coming up. But a frequent reason for rejecting manuscripts is because the editor does not consider that the research is sufficiently substantial. You may have done an experiment for just 1 year and you want to publish it. But the journal may expect you to be presenting results from 2 or 3 years research. So this is quite common. It's a quite frequent reason for having manuscripts rejected. And I had a PhD student recently in Newcastle who was telling me that she thought it would be worthwhile to write up and publish some of the work that she had been doing with some of my wheat varieties in Newcastle. And I was telling her, well, yes, but people have been publishing research on this subject for 40 years. And all you are doing is using different varieties. But she said, oh yes, but it's still going to be worthwhile. And I was trying to explain to her that, well, you've got to find something new in the story that's going to make it worthwhile to publish. If there are going to be 50 other research publications looking at this subject, which was salt responses in wheat, and she's got another 10 genotypes of wheat that she's looked at, then nobody's going to be interested in publishing this unless there's something special, something that makes this interesting. So have a think about that. This final statement is worthwhile for you to consider as well. If the journal accepts your manuscript for publication, is it going to increase the journal's impact factor? And if after careful consideration you think, well, I don't know, then maybe you should be looking for a different journal, or you should be redesigning the way that you present the information to make it more attractive to the journal. Now, your research should be describing what's in this world, not the one on the left, but I'll show you the graph on the right-hand side as well. Your research should be describing what's on the right-hand side, the figure there. But very often, what is submitted to journals is represented by the figure on the left, where we have poorly justified research, poorly designed research, poorly described research, and little evidence of genuine progress in terms of an increase in the knowledge. So you've got to make sure that what you are submitting to a journal is the figure on the right, which is well justified research. It needs to be done. It is well designed research. It is well described, and there's a clear impact, clear increase in our knowledge, as shown by the difference in the height of the two bars. So your target is the figure on the right-hand side. So let's assume that you have something that is suitable for publishing. I'm going to give now a few pieces of advice about journals to select and what and how to go to the next stage. Always start by reading the journal's information for authors. When I was doing most of my research, I used to get that by going to the library and looking at the inside cover of the journals. Nowadays, you do it all on their website. First, you need to identify whether it's the right journal for your paper. And here are some comments that I've taken from a number of journals in their section on information for authors. And you can see the sort of comments that journals will make to guide authors in how to submit their manuscripts. So here's one that says, descriptive reports in which no specific hypothesis is tested are unlikely to be accepted. So how many of you write descriptive papers? Do any of you write papers just describing what you found rather than testing any particular hypothesis? Do you really, Dushan? Oh, but you get them published. Oh, all right. Then we have field study results are more likely to be accepted if they use more than a single technique of data collection and analysis. Then we have papers must be original research and must not have already been published or be under consideration for publication elsewhere. It's like computers, computer processing. You can either have serial processing or you can have parallel processing. Now, in terms of a scientific manuscript, it has to be serial processing, one after the other. So if you write a paper, you submit it to one journal and one journal only. Then when you get the results from that, if it's unsuccessful, you submit it to another journal. You do not submit your manuscript to 2 or 3 journals simultaneously. I do know that that happens, because I have seen, through contacts that I have seen essentially identical text appear in different publications. So people are just copying, pasting papers in several journals. So once you have decided which journal you will submit the paper to, you then have to read very carefully all of the instructions to authors, which will give you guidance on how to write the text. And I've got just one example that I'll show you here, which is Annals of Botany. Instructions for authors, manuscript preparation, and just focus on the text in red. It says for margins, approximately 25 millimeter margins. Now, this is a journal that is published in the UK, and it uses the European metric system. If you publish in an American journal, it will use the old imperial system, feet and inches. Then it will tell you a margin of 1 inch, for example. This journal says all pages should be numbered sequentially, and furthermore, each line of the text should be numbered, and it shows you how to find that in Word under the menu format. And then it says further down, make sure the language is English UK. So you know there are different sorts of English. There's my English, which is UK English. And then there's American, there's US English. And the Americans, they don't know how to spell. So a lot of their words are wrong. And the Australians, they have their version of English as well. So make sure they just use different words. So make sure that you check which version of English you need to set your keyboard to for the journal that you're going to be submitting to. And not bothering to follow all the journal's instructions, it creates a bad impression from the start. If I'm the journal editor and I have a quick look through your manuscript as it comes in to me, and I find that you haven't bothered to follow any of my journal's instructions, then it immediately puts me in a bad mood. It doesn't make me favourable towards your manuscript. So you've got to make sure you follow the instructions. So this is your starting point, question mark. And that's your finishing point, question mark. Because at the beginning, you don't know how you're going to start, do you? I was going to say you take the pen in your hand, but nowadays you don't actually use pens, do you? I did. I wrote, most of my scientific papers were written with pen and paper. Well, I started writing in the 1970s, you see, so... Different century, yes, that shows you how old I am. Oh dear. Actually, it was interesting then because when we were at school, I remember, this was in the sixth form, we were taken on a special excursion. This was a special sixth form student excursion to see a computer. And we were driven in this minibus to this factory where they had this huge machine and it had all this paper going through. Wonderful. Yeah. So I've got mine in my pocket. Right, so that's your starting point. You don't know where you're going to start from. You don't know what the first word is going to be. And you don't really know where you're going to end up. But you've got to convert that from question mark into once upon a time, di-da, 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 Detje Biker. And it's got to finish up and they all lived happily ever after. Now, the reason that I have used this analogy to the children's story is that if you think about children's stories, they're written very simply. As you turn the page of a children's storybook, all of the text goes obviously, clearly from the previous page, doesn't it? It's very easy to follow a children's story. It has to be easy, otherwise the children can't follow it. You've got to take the same attitude when you are writing a scientific paper. You don't start your first sentence, once upon a time, I had this bright idea. You may have had a good idea, but you've got to be thinking in that frame of mind. Because you've got to make sure that the way that you present the information is going to be easy, even for a child to be able to understand. So you've got to make sure that you start off the story with a clear definition of why it needs to be done. Then you describe what you did, and then you summarize what the results are. You say, this is where we got to, and this has therefore confirmed our original idea. Or our results have disproved this particular hypothesis. But it's a series of events that everybody can follow easily. So let's just assume that you have a good story to tell. The secrets to writing and submitting a good quality scientific paper, which is actually true for any document. The secrets are to be logical, clear, concise, unambiguous, consistent, without factual errors, and without any technical errors. So if you can do that, then you're writing a good quality manuscript. So I'll explain what I mean by each of those. If you don't manage that, you will find the reviewers will have difficulty reading and understanding what you wrote. You will have comments on your reviewer's report that say they couldn't understand what you were doing, it wasn't clear, and so on. So, what do I mean by each of those points? Logical. It's got to have flow. It's got to have obvious connection, one step to the next. So points need to go clearly from one to the next. Clear, it has to be easy to read in a simple language. In a simple language that's easy to understand. Now, when I am correcting the English for scientists who've sent me their manuscripts, what I find myself doing very often with people from Serbia is that I'm cutting out a lot of the words. Because I find that it's part of your culture. It's the way that you do it in Serbian if you're writing a scientific manuscript. You put in words that in English are not necessary. So I spend a lot of my time going around cutting it out. And long sentences. And very often you will use a phrase that is, let's say, 5 words, and I can reorganize that to use only 2 words. So I find myself very often reorganizing sentences and making them shorter and therefore easier for others to read and to understand. Now, it's easy for me to tell you this, but it is a challenge for you to be able to follow that approach. But very often, this will be a reason why manuscripts are rejected. The English just doesn't read nicely. So, I have got a few slides at the end of this part of the course on how to improve the English, but in the time available, I'm afraid it's only one or two examples. But it may help. So concise, no unnecessary words. Even a lot of English-speaking scientists from the UK, they like to put in words which are not necessary. And I've got one slide at the end, which is an appendix of a book on scientific writing, which will give you examples of the way that words are used unnecessarily. And it will show you how you can just cut out the word. You don't need it because it has no information content. I like to think about words in terms of their information content. What information is it giving to the reader by having that word in? And if the answer is, it doesn't tell you anything, then it doesn't need to be there. So, unambiguous, only one way to interpret what you write. Consistent, which means the same information every time you mention it. Table and figure data correctly reported in the text. All the references cited in the text and in the reference list, and so on. And it should be without factual errors, which means that you check for consistency between what the table shows, the numbers in the tables, and any information you put from the table in the text. And without technical errors, checked with the journal style to make sure that the formatting is consistent. And this business of formatting, maybe I'm just very strong, but I like to see consistent formatting, because I believe it reflects the personality of the people who are writing the manuscript. If they are inconsistent in the way that they type the information, so that they have paragraph, you start off a paragraph with the indent. If they're not consistent in the spaces between lines, if they're not consistent in the way that they present the references, then it tells me that their brains are not functioning in the right way to be a good quality scientist. So I believe that consistency, especially in formatting, is a sign of a good quality researcher. And no spelling mistakes. Maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but I find a large number of manuscripts that are sent to me for checking to improve the English, they have simple spelling mistakes in them. So English words are not spelt correctly. Now, the reason for that is that you are typing in Serbian. Well, you're typing English words, but on a Serbian keyboard with your language in the computer, wherever it's set. In my laptop, it's set up at the top. You are typing in a keyboard that's not an English keyboard. And therefore, if you're using Word, and I would imagine most people will use Word, you don't see all the little red underlining for all the mistakes, because your computer's set to Serbian. So, every word's a mistake as far as your computer's concerned. But if you set the language to English, UK or US or whatever is needed, then it will identify for you when you are typing a word that's not in the computer's memory. And if it's a simple English word that you've just typed the wrong letters for, then it will tell you. So you can identify that. Oh, yes. Okay, that's that slide. And again, I said if I'm an editor of a journal, I haven't been an editor of a journal, but I've been on editorial review boards. If I'm the journal editor and the first page of your manuscript that I look at, I find has got mistakes, spelling errors, formatting doesn't look good, then it automatically creates a bad impression on the quality of your research. I already know that the quality of your manuscript's not going to be very good, but because I believe this to be a quality of you as a researcher, or you and your team as a researcher, then I believe it's important for you to make a good impression at the beginning. So, if there's lack of care in putting your manuscript together, that implies to me, it suggests to me, that there could be lack of care in doing the research. You see? So think about this very carefully. And if there's lack of care with the research, maybe you're not getting the truth, maybe your manuscript reflects research like the left-hand figure, where the bars disappear in Magla, rather than the one on the right-hand side.